they're setting you right up for something else, right? And eventually, we enjoy where the story is resolved at the end. I don't know about you, but if you've ever watched a television series, they're really, really good at ending an episode, leaving you hanging, right? You're hanging on the edge thinking, what's going to happen next? And they do that on purpose, right? Because they want you to come back and watch the next episode. But they're very good at that. You get to the end of the episode, a phone call comes in, you can see the reaction on their face, and then, boom, it's over, right? You go to the credits, and you have to come back to watch the next episode. Well, last week we had a bit of an abrupt ending in our story. Fortunately, the story doesn't end where we left off last week, but we came to a bit of an abrupt ending in the story, and I ended it abruptly last week on purpose as we see what happened there. So we come to the part in Joseph's life that at this point here today, we are finally going to have a little bit of relief from the challenges that he has faced. For Joseph, it has been one mistreatment after the other, leading him up to this point. Now, there is going to be more challenges in the story ahead, so it's not all over. But we have seen many challenges, and today we're finally going to see something come together and work out, and you may know this story. Today we're going to see that through all of the hardship faced, Joseph still had a strong faith in God. Just as Addie just sang for us, he understood it's not about me, my life is not my own, it's about what God is doing through me. Now, the big picture that we're going to see in this story is that for God to preserve his people, he must put Joseph in the right place. Joseph is going to be the tool to help preserve his people, the nation of Israel. And in the passage we will look at today in Genesis 41, Joseph is finally going to be put in that place. So everything that we have studied, everything that we've looked at is so that eventually Joseph would be put in this place. Now, God could have done it another way. I think I've said that already, but this is the path that God chose to finally put Joseph in this place. And then next week, we'll see how that story unfolds. So a quick reminder, Joseph was falsely accused, thrown into prison. In prison, he interpreted 2 dreams. We looked at that last week. This is significant because it helps us understand this chapter. Last chapter sets up for what we're going to study today. We have the butler and the baker that had these dreams. Joseph interprets that in 3 days, the baker will be killed and the butler restored to his position, and both happen. Joseph asked the butler to remember him. Note that he didn't ask the baker, but he asked the butler, okay? Because he was very confident in what God had given to him. But when we come to this chapter, we understand Joseph is waiting in prison. He's been in prison for 2 years due to this false accusation. He had this hope, but nothing had come out of it. So for today, I'm preaching a message entitled Pharaoh's Dreams Interpreted. Pharaoh's Dreams Interpreted. Well, let's look here this morning. We've already read, but God sends 2 dreams to Pharaoh. So last week we talked about 2 dreams. This week we're also going to have 2 dreams. These 2 dreams are to Pharaoh. Pastor Matt led us in reading the opening portion of this chapter, so we won't read it again. But after 2 years, it begins here. Could be a reference to the beginning of thrown into jail or from the dreams. Either way, we understand that Joseph has spent at least 2 years in prison. And now we come to something that, by the way, 2 years in prison for something he didn't do. And we come to this storyline as we pick up here this morning that now here in prison, God sends dreams to Pharaoh. Now, he did this with the baker and the butler, and God's fingerprints have to be seen all over this. As you look at this, God's fingerprints are seen all over this. He sent the dreams to the baker and the butler at the same time. Similar dreams, except different interpretations. And now Pharaoh has two dreams. So as was read earlier, Pharaoh was standing by the Nile. The Nile was a well-known river in that day. It was a prominent part of their life. So everyone would have understood the Nile River. They would have understood this. It's familiar. Now the dream. 14 cows in the first dream. 7 of them are plump. They are well-fed cows. And then there are 7 thin cows. Now you have possibly seen both in your lifetime, and you would think the 7 fat cows are well-fed, they're stronger. If anything's going to happen here, if there's a competition between the two, the 7 well-fed cows would win the competition. But the lean cows come up out of the water and they devour the fat cows in this dream. Pharaoh wakes up and he remembers this dream, but then he goes back to sleep. And he has another dream. Now this dream is virtually the same, just ears of corn or grain in this case. So you have 7 plump, good ears of corn, and they come up. And then you have 7 thin ears, and they come up and they devour the good ears of corn. And Pharaoh wakes up and he is pondering on this dream, so much so that he is troubled by it. So he does what a king would do. We've seen this in another instance as well in Daniel. He calls for his magicians, his wise men, to come help interpret and help him understand what this dream is all about. And so he calls them all in. He explains this dream to them, and much to his dismay, they have no answer. Nothing. They can't explain it. I imagine that these wise men, these magicians, are quite embarrassed as they're standing there with nothing to say. They're probably also scared, understanding that the fact that we can't come up with a satisfactory answer could mean that we're in trouble, we're in jeopardy. So that's the first 8 verses, as was read earlier. Let's notice next this morning that God enables Joseph to interpret the dreams. God enables Joseph to interpret the dreams. And we see that in verses 9 and following. So let's do some reading here. And before we get there, though, it's at this point that everything begins to come together. Remember the butler who back in verse 23 of chapter 40 had forgotten Joseph. Right, he got restored to his position. He was probably so thrilled to be back in his position and out of prison that he just forgot all about it. But at this point, it all comes back to the butler. Now, we might say, shame on that butler for having forgotten. And again, God could have worked this out a different way. But from a human perspective, we would look at this and say, why did you wait this long? Why didn't you say something earlier? Joseph perhaps could have been out of prison sooner, but from a divine, from a heavenly perspective, from a sovereign perspective, the Lord brings this to his mind at just the right time because he is working his master plan. Now, you have likely had something happen that has jogged your memory, right? You're in a conversation and somebody tells a story and all of a sudden it brings something back to you that happened years and years ago you haven't even thought about for years, but it just comes back to you. Now, that's happened to you. And from a human perspective, we can understand that. Something comes up. But from a biblical, divine perspective here, this information has been held so that at the perfect moment it could come forth and accomplish God's purposes. So notice now verse number 9, we're in chapter 41. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was with us a young man a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and here it is, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dreams he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. So all of a sudden, the memory comes back to this man. He remembers what happened. He relays, just what this young man, this Hebrew said was exactly how it came to be. So this news is now given. Look at verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. Verse 14, Joseph is summoned. Notice this, at the beginning of verse 14, Joseph is a prisoner in prison. But in just one verse here in Scripture, everything is changed. By the conclusion of this verse, he is in the presence of Pharaoh. It happens quickly. Joseph is summoned. He's brought up out of the prison. He needs to make himself presentable. He couldn't just walk in his prison look and his prison clothes. He is changed. He is shaved. He's made to look clean, and he walks in before Pharaoh. Verse 15. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. Now, for the most part, you and I would say, boy, if we got pulled in like that, oh boy, right? But Joseph had seen what God could do. Joseph understood that God was in the midst of all of this. So Pharaoh explains this dilemma, verse 16. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Don't miss what verse 16 brings out for us. Joseph, after all he has been through, as we brought out from a human perspective, he would have every right to complain, be upset, be angry. And from a human perspective, none of us would blame him for all that he's been through. He's the victim in all of this, we could say. But through everything he's been through, Joseph boldly explains to Pharaoh, it has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with the Lord. Joseph has not lost his faith in God. Joseph is still completely dependent on the Lord. And what a powerful example of a man who remained firm in his faith despite all the wrongdoings that had come his way. In a sense, Joseph was a lone ranger too. Now, we're not told about all those in the prison around him, but our guess is he didn't have a bunch of prisoners who also believed in God and were trying to encourage him along. My guess is it was a fairly rough crowd there in prison. Joseph didn't have a church family to gather around him and carry him through all this difficulties. He was on his own, separated from his family, yet he remained faithful to the Lord. Now in verses 17 all the way down through verse 24, Pharaoh relays the dream to Joseph. And I won't reread all of those, or I won't read those for you, as it essentially restates what was read earlier in the beginning of this chapter in verses 1 through 8. And he expresses the dream. So we've seen that. We hear about the 7 cows, the fat cows, the skinny cows, the ears of corn that follow that as well. Let's go down now to verse 24. As it finishes up what was said there, and the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears, so that finishes it up. And now notice the problem here. And I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. But the problem is, nobody can interpret this. Nobody understands what is happening here. Now, it's great for us because we have this whole story. Many of you are probably very familiar with the story of Joseph, and it's easy for us because we can see all of this. But if you were truly in those shoes trying to figure this out, I would have been clueless too. Verse 25, and Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. So yes, Pharaoh, there are two dreams, but essentially you've had going to be taught here. Verse 26, the seven good kind are 7 years, and the 7 good years are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kind that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty years blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh, what God is about to do. He showeth unto Pharaoh, behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. And there shall arise after them 7 years of famine. And all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of the famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So 7 years. The 7 good kind, or plump cows, refer to the good. The 7 ears, the good ears, the plump ears, refer to 7 good years. And then you have the thin ones, and those refer to bad years, famine. So Egypt is going to have 7 great, plenteous years, but that will be eclipsed and forgotten because they will be followed by 7 years of severe famine. And according to verse 32, it was showed twice to you for God to show you just how certain this is. There's no mistake here. Now think about this. What a weather report, right? I mean, we look at the weather, and of course, this summer, if there's even a slight chance of rain, I figure it's going to rain, okay? But if you don't know any of this, and you enjoy 7 years, you get to the end of the 7th year, you might even think, you know what, don't even bother bringing in all the crop because, we've just had so many good years. We have plenty of food on hand. Don't worry about it. We'll get more next year. It'll be fine. But if you know this, it totally changes the way you're going to think. And think about the news as Pharaoh gets this news. Bad news. I imagine Pharaoh's a little bit panicked at this point. 7 years, that's a long ways away, so he doesn't have anything to worry about right away. But, boy, he realizes that if he has 7 years of famine, that is going to be devastating in their land. But then God gives Joseph further words here because this presents a massive problem for Pharaoh, but Joseph also provides an amazing solution. And again, the Lord is all over this. You have to see God's fingerprints all over this. Verse 33, now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land and take up a 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And the food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. At this point, Joseph proposes a solution. And it's a fairly simple solution. It's going to take some work, but appoint somebody, and over the next 7 years of plenty, so people will have plenty, just take 20%. Take a 5th, take 20% of it, and put it into storage over the next 7 years. So you will store up all of this excess crop. And then when we come to those years of famine, we'll be able to survive off of it. It's simply wise planning. So God has given Joseph the interpretation of the dream. God has given Joseph the plan in order to enact what needs to be done, and now it really comes together. Notice next that God exalts Joseph to power. God exalts Joseph to power. Now, I realize Pharaoh is going to have part in all of this, but you must see God's hand in all of this as God will bring him to power. Verse number 37, and the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. Do you remember back in verse 14, I noted that when we started verse 14, Joseph was nothing more than a prisoner as far as the land of Egypt was concerned. I would guess that Joseph has, at this point here, when we get to this verse, Joseph has been out of prison for a matter of hours. Now, I don't know the exact time frame, but it hasn't been long at all that Joseph has been out of prison. Now, from a prisoner, verse 37 tells us that Joseph was made to be second in command in all of Egypt. Everything Joseph said was agreeable to Pharaoh. And as Pharaoh looks at this man and he sees the wisdom that is there, he decides, you know what? This is the one. This is the man that I should appoint to that. He sees the Spirit of God in this man. What an example. And he makes him second in command. Again, you must see God at work in all of this. And it's not a storyline you just can make up out of nowhere and see, oh, that's what's going to happen. But God is at work in all of this. Verse 41, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. Prison garments are gone. Now he has fine linen and a gold chain around his neck. Verse 43, and he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried before him, bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him to wife Asenath of the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, and Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. So from a prisoner, and mind you, he rose in the prison, right? He was helpful there. He was faithful with that, right? He was faithful in Potiphar's house. He was faithful in the prison. You see the principle there, right? You be faithful where God places you, and now God makes him second in command in all of Egypt. He's given Pharaoh's ring, which would be used to make an impression and carry the weight and authority of the ruler. He is giving the clothing of a ruler, a gold chain. He rides in Pharaoh's other chariot. He is now being bowed down to and has incredible power in the land. He's even given an Egyptian name. And he's given a wife, and he travels extensively throughout Egypt. Think of the transformation for Joseph from the young man that was in that pit, in that prison, and now riding around Egypt in the chariot with people bowing down to him. And at this point in the story, the tension has relieved a little bit, right? Everything has been going wrong for Joseph. Everything seems to be going the wrong direction. But now he gets placed in this position of authority. Everything isn't resolved yet. We still have a matter with some family matters and some other things that need to be taken care of. We'll get to all of that. But from the boy thrown in the pit to the second highest ruler in Egypt, Joseph stayed faithful to the Lord. What an example. But now, God has placed him in the exact seat to preserve his people, the nation of Israel. The story continues. It gets better for Joseph. Most cases I've been saying it's going to get worse for him. It actually gets better. Notice finally here, or fourthly rather, God prospers Joseph. Verse 46. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls, and he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid the food in the cities, the food of every field which was round about every city, laid he up the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh. For God, he said, hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim. For God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Joseph's about 30 years old or so as all of this starts to unfold. And now in these years to follow, coming out of prison, we see that Joseph is prosperous. He had great prosperity. Prior to this, everything was falling apart. But now it's working out well. He gathers food, he piles it up. Verse 49 reads that we can't even count it. It is without number. His personal life prospers. His wife, he has a child. He has another child. He gives them Hebrew names, if you caught that in verses 51 and 52. And that was a statement in and of itself. As these names have further meanings, Manasseh, God has made me forget, and Ephraim, God has made me fruitful. Joseph is prosperous. God is blessing. But he is also preparing him for what is about to come. And then, notice finally for this morning, and fifthly, God sent the famine. Verse 53 as we finish off the chapter. And the 7 years of plenteous that was in the land of Egypt were ended. Just like that, we're past 7 years, okay? And the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said, and the dearth was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. So just as he predicted, there is famine in the land, and now the people cry out, and Pharaoh says, Don't talk to me, go see Joseph. Go talk to him. But then notice 57. We've already been told this because it's all over the earth, but in all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all the lands. Now, once again today, we're going to end here, right? And what I want to bring out for you is that it's all over the earth. All the nations are coming to him, and that means that at this moment, the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, who were not clued into what happened in Egypt are now without food. And that means that those brothers that put Joseph in a pit are without food. That means that Joseph's father, who thinks he's dead, is without food, or a great lack of food. And we're going to pick up with that story next week. So come back for that next week. Lord willing, we will continue that story. But as I brought out, in conclusion, may I just again mention to you Joseph's faithfulness despite how everything had gone bad and then went well. Joseph stayed faithful to the Lord. See God's hand in all of this, putting Joseph in the exact right place in order to preserve his people. And as I've brought out in this series, but I'll remind you again today, and I'll probably remind you again, is that we must understand that God is at work in a much bigger way than we can understand. And even when we don't like what we're going through right now, we must trust in the Lord that He is bringing it all together. Now, next week, we are going to see what I'm going to call an unplanned family reunion. An unplanned family reunion. But as I wrap up today, I want you to know that God will preserve His people through Joseph, and we'll see that next week. But I want you to understand, too, that God is a God of provision. And I want to remind you of another provision that He has made. And that provision is that God has provided His Son, Jesus Christ, in order to save people from their sins. And I just remind you today that we serve an awesome God. And the same God that would preserve the nation of Israel way back here in the life of Joseph has given the provision of His dear Son, Jesus Christ, so that you and I could have eternal life. And I just remind you that we as sinners are in need of a Savior, and God has provided His Son, Jesus Christ, who went to the cross and died on the cross, shedding His blood, was buried but rose again, and offers the gift of eternal life, the provision of His Son, so that we could have salvation. The nation of Israel is going to be preserved. They're going to be saved from death, physically speaking, through Joseph, as we will see next week. But God has made a provision of His Son so that you and I could be saved from eternal damnation, eternal separation from God in an awful place called hell, if we will come and by His grace, through faith in Jesus Christ, place our faith in Him. We too can have everlasting life. God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. And if you have never come in faith to Jesus Christ, you aren't sure about that today, we'd love for you to settle that matter. Back to Joseph, I want to remind you of one verse in the Psalms. And the verse is this. It's found in Psalm 37, verse number 23. It says this: "The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and He delighteth in His way." We're going to close with this song in just a moment. The trouble is that sometimes when God orders the steps, He doesn't do it the way we would want it done. Ever had that trouble? I sure have, many times. Listen to the first verse of the song that we're going to sing. It says this: "Though dark be the night and long be the day, Lord, make me follow in Thy perfect way. Though cometh sorrow, though great be my pain, Lord, make me serve Thee, come sunshine or rain." And then the chorus goes on. And it bookends perfectly today with the song that Addie sang earlier, that my life is not about me, it doesn't belong to me, it's not all about what I want, it's about what God wants. Joseph demonstrated that. The songs that we'll sing this in conclusion today will fit perfectly with that as well. Joseph went through sorrow and pain, yet he remained faithful to serve the Lord. Believer, despite the challenges of the path, despite the fact that is not the way that you like it, Even if it doesn't make any sense to you, remember that the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. Let's pray.